This photograph of 3 children seems innocent until historians discovered the real story behind it. The photograph arrived at the Nebraska State Historical Society in a donated collection from an estate sale in Omaha. Rachel Morrison, a curator specializing in pioneer-era photography, opened the archival box one quiet afternoon. She expected the usual collection of family portraits, wedding pictures and old landscape images of fields and farms. What she found instead was a large treasure of nearly 200 photographs that carefully documented daily life in rural Nebraska from 1890 to 1930. Many of the images were unlabeled and unidentified, but one photograph immediately caught her full attention and would not let go. It showed 3 children standing close together on what appeared to be a wooden train platform. There were 2 girls and 1 boy, estimated by Rachel to be roughly 6, 8, and 10 years old. They wore matching dark wool coats that looked new and freshly pressed. Their hair had been neatly combed, and their faces were scrubbed clean. The boy stood in the middle with a girl on each side, and all 3 were holding hands tightly. At first glance, it looked like a typical portrait of siblings dressed in their Sunday best, perhaps waiting to travel to visit relatives or posing before some special family occasion. The children's expressions were very serious and still, which was common in photographs from that time because of the long exposure times required by the old cameras. But Rachel noticed something deeper in their faces that troubled her. It was not simple fear, and not just ordinary sadness. It was a heavy, resigned look in their young eyes, as if they already understood that something difficult and permanent was about to happen. She turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded pencil, was a single line. Orphan train arrivals, Grand Island Depot, April 1912. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She had read about the orphan train movement in history books, but she had never seen direct, personal documentation from Nebraska. She examined the photograph more carefully under better light. Details she had missed at first suddenly became very important. The children's coats, although they looked new, did not fit properly. The boy's sleeves were too short and exposed his thin wrists. The younger girl's coat hung well past him. Our knees, clearly made for an older child. The older girl's coat was buttoned incorrectly, as if someone else had dressed her quickly and nervously. Rachel reached for her magnifying glass and studied the image even more closely. That is when she saw the small white rectangles pinned to each child's chest. They were identification cards or tags. The boy wore number 23, the younger girl number 24, and the older girl number 25. They had been numbered like livestock or pieces of inventory waiting to be claimed. At the children's feet were 3 small cloth bags or bundles, the kind that might hold only a few changes of clothes and a handful of personal belongings. Each bag had a different name tag attached. The boy's bag read Thomas Riley. The younger girl's read Margaret O'Brien. The older girl's read Catherine Murphy. They were not brothers and sisters. They were 3 separate children, likely orphans or abandoned kids from New York or another crowded eastern city. They had been dressed alike and posed together to look like a family unit. Rachel felt a wave of sickness wash over her as the full meaning settled in. This was not a happy family portrait. This was clear documentation of a transaction. Behind the 3 children, slightly out of focus, several adults stood watching. Men wearing suits and hats, women in long dresses, were standing in small clusters. Some were pointing toward the children or checking papers in their hands. These were prospective parents, farmers, shopkeepers, and housewives who had come to the train station that day to select children for their homes and farms, or more accurately, as Rachel knew from her research, to select free labor for their land and businesses. Rachel spent the next 2 full days reading and researching everything she could find about the orphan trains. What she discovered was a complicated chapter in American history that some people celebrated as great charity, while others condemned it as a form of child trafficking. The movement had begun in 1854, founded by a man named Charles Loring Brace through the Children's Aid Society of New York. Brace had been shocked by the huge number of homeless and orphaned children living on the dangerous streets of New York City, children who slept in alleyways, stole food to survive, and faced disease, abuse, and early death every single day. His solution was to send children west on trains to rural areas where farming families might adopt them and give them better lives. Between 1854 and 1929, more than 200,000 children were placed through this system. They traveled in groups, sometimes dozens at a time, accompanied by agents from charitable organizations. When the train stopped in a town, the children were lined up at the depot or local church. Local people would inspect them, ask questions, and choose which children they wanted to take home. Some children truly found love, security, and good opportunities. Others were treated as cheap workers, forced to do hard labor, and sometimes abused. Many were separated from their real brothers and sisters and never saw them again. Rachel contacted Dr. Stephen Walsh, a respected historian at the University of Nebraska who had studied the orphan train movement for many years. He was excited when she sent him the photograph. He told her it was an extremely rare and valuable image because it captured the tense moment right before the children were selected. Working together, they carefully identified the 3 children using old orphanage records, train manifests, and census documents. Thomas Riley as 10 years old. He had been born in Manhattan to Irish immigrant parents. Both his mother and father died in a typhoid outbreak when he was 6. Margaret O'Brien was 6 years old and had been abandoned at age 2 with only a short note pinned to her coat. Catherine Murphy was 8. Her mother had died in childbirth, and later her father surrendered her because he could not care for her. On April 22, 1912, the 3 children arrived together on the orphan train. Within just a few hours they were separated and sent to different families in different directions. Thomas went to a large wheat farm with the Hendricks family. Margaret went to a dairy farm with the Swinson family. Catherine went to live with the Peterson family, who ran a general store in town. Thomas worked long hours on the farm from a very young age, but was never formally adopted. In a recorded interview many years later, he spoke calmly but honestly. He said the Hendricks family gave him food and shelter, but they were his employers, not his real family. He never forgot the heartbreaking moment when little Margaret screamed his name as strangers pulled her away from him. Margaret's short life was especially tragic. She suffered many injuries while working on the dairy farm. A concerned local school teacher wrote a letter describing her poor health, frequent accidents, and undernourished condition, but sadly no one took meaningful action to help her. She died in 1917 at only 11 years old from pneumonia that followed a serious farm accident. Catherine had a somewhat better life. She attended school, worked in the family store, and later married. Yet in her private diary from the 1940s, she wrote movingly about the deep loneliness she always felt. She described the terror of that day on the train platform and how she never stopped thinking about Thomas and Margaret. She kept a special piece of paper where she wrote their names over and over across many years, along with a quiet prayer hoping they had found peace and love. Rachel felt strongly that these children's stories needed to be told properly. She organized a thoughtful exhibition at the Nebraska State Historical Society titled Separated: The Untold Stories of Orphan Train Children. The enlarged photograph of Thomas, Margaret, and Catherine became the powerful centerpiece. The exhibition included their original orphanage records, placement reports, census information, personal writings, and honest historical context about both the good and bad sides of the orphan train system. Descendants of Thomas and Catherine came to see it. They stood quietly in front of the photograph, many of them learning the full, painful truth about their family history for the very first time. 6 months later, Rachel organized a moving memorial service. She placed special memorial markers at each of the 3 children's graves. Each marker featured the famous photograph and words honoring the children who had held each other's hands so tightly on that spring day in 1912 before being forced apart. Family members, historians, and members of the community attended the service. They left flowers and small tokens, remembering 3 children who had suffered, survived in their own ways, and deserved to be seen as real human beings rather than just numbers on a train. The photograph that had arrived quietly in a donated box now hangs permanently in the Nebraska State Historical Society. It serves as a quiet but powerful reminder that old images often hide deep and painful stories. It shows us that looking closely at the past can reveal important truths. And above all, it proves that 3 children holding hands on a train platform in 1912 still have a story worth remembering more than a century later. Their desperate grip, their serious young faces, and their numbered tags continue to speak across time, asking us never to forget them.